Night. My stepmother handed me a box of garbage bags and told me to be out by morning. She was smiling. Not a small smile. A wide, satisfied smile, like she'd been rehearsing it for years. And maybe she had. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my grandmother had spent the last 3 years building something none of them could touch. A foundation, a trust, and a letter that would eventually be read aloud in a room full of people who had spent years pretending I didn't exist. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old and I'm a pastry chef, not the kind who makes birthday cakes at a grocery store. The kind who spent 6 years training in kitchens in Charleston, New York, and eventually under a James Beard-nominated chef in Austin. The kind who built a reputation slowly, quietly, and entirely on my own, because no one in my family was going to help me do it. My grandmother was the exception. She always was. My mother passed away when I was 9, a car accident on a Tuesday in November. The kind of ordinary, awful thing that changes the entire shape of your life. My father remarried 3 years later. Her name was Diane. She had 2 daughters from her first marriage, Brittany and Kayla. And from the moment she moved into our house in Savannah, it was clear that she had no interest in pretending I was part of the family she was building. My father wasn't a cruel man. He was a weak one, which is sometimes worse. He saw what was happening and chose not to see it. He told me I was too sensitive. He told me Diane was adjusting. He told me things would get better. They didn't get better. They just became the new normal. The only constant in my childhood was my grandmother, my mother's mother, who lived 40 minutes away in a pale yellow house with a wraparound porch and a kitchen that always smelled like brown butter and vanilla. She taught me to bake when I was 10. She told me it was something my mother had loved too. Every Saturday I was allowed to go to her house, and every Saturday I did, without fail, for 8 years. She was the one who drove me to my culinary school interview. She was the one who sat with me on that porch the summer I was 22 and told me that talent without courage is just a daydream. She was the one who called me every Sunday until the Sunday she couldn't anymore. She passed away 14 months ago, on a Thursday, in the hospital room where I held her hand for the last 4 hours of her life. Diane and my father arrived 40 minutes after she was gone. I remember thinking, even in that moment, that the timing said everything. What happened in the weeks that followed was a kind of quiet unraveling that I don't think I fully understood, until it was already over. My grandmother's estate was modest on the surface, the yellow house a savings account, some furniture and jewelry, and a collection of cast iron skillets she'd been adding to since the 1970s. There was a will. My father's lawyer, Diane's cousin as it happened, reviewed it and told the family that the estate would be divided equally among surviving family members, which the lawyer interpreted to include Diane and her daughters. I didn't have my own lawyer at the time. I didn't know I needed one. I was also, in those weeks, in the middle of the most important professional moment of my career. I had been named as a co-founder and head pastry chef for a restaurant called Linden, opening in Charleston with 2 partners, a front-of-house director named Marcus, and a line cook turned executive chef named Priya. We had investors, we had a lease. We had a menu I had spent 14 months developing, a concept built around Southern ingredients and French technique, the kind of thing I had been working toward my entire adult life. I had also, quietly, been using my grandmother's kitchen as a test space for over a year. She had encouraged it. She loved having the house smell like caramelized sugar and toasted pecans. She would sit at the table with her coffee and tell me which things worked and which things didn't. And she was almost always right. 3 weeks after her funeral, Diane called me into the living room of what had been my grandmother's house. She and my father were sitting on the couch. Brittany and Kayla were in the armchairs. The lawyer, Diane's cousin Gary, who I had met twice and did not trust either time, was standing near the window. They told me that the estate had been fully assessed. They told me that the house would be sold and the proceeds divided. They told me that my portion, after fees and adjustments that Gary explained in a language designed to be confusing, came to just under $11,000. Diane's portion, along with Brittany's and Kayla's, came to just over $400,000. I asked Gary how that was possible. He explained that my grandmother had apparently restructured her assets in her final years in ways that shifted the majority of the liquid holdings into a joint account that Diane's name had been added to, my father's wife, who had never once visited my grandmother in the hospital, and that the legal documentation supported this interpretation of the estate. My father looked at the floor the entire time. I left without the $11,000. I left without anything except the cast iron skillets, which Gary told me I could take because they had no meaningful monetary value. I went home and I called Marcus and told him I needed 2 days. He gave me 2 days. I spent those 2 days sitting with the cast iron skillets on my kitchen table and trying to figure out what had just happened. At some point during the second night, I picked up my phone and started looking for an estate attorney. Not Gary. Not anyone connected to my father's world. Someone independent. Her name was Rebecca. She had an office in Charleston and a reputation for exactly the kind of case I was about to describe to her. When I walked in and told her what had happened, she listened for about 20 minutes without interrupting me. Then she asked me one question. Did your grandmother ever mention a different attorney? Someone separate from your father's family? I thought about it. I remembered something my grandmother had said about a year before she passed. Something offhand about having had lunch with an old friend who happened to be a lawyer, someone she'd known since her church days. I'd thought nothing of it at the time. Rebecca told me to find out who that was. It took me 2 weeks, 3 phone calls to my grandmother's church, and 1 conversation with a woman named Dorothy who had been my grandmother's closest friend for 40 years. Dorothy gave me the name without hesitation, like she'd been waiting for someone to ask. His name was Walter. He was 74 years old, semi-retired, and operated a small firm out of an office above a dry cleaner in a town called Hardyville, about an hour from Savannah. When I called him, he answered on the second ring. When I told him my name, he said quietly that he had been wondering when I would call. He asked me to come in. I drove to Hardyville on a Wednesday morning. Walter's office had wood-paneled walls and smelled like old paper and coffee, and he had a file folder on his desk with my name on it that was 3 inches thick. He told me that my grandmother had come to him 2 years and 8 months before she died. She had been watching what was happening in the family. She had seen how Diane operated, the slow accumulation of access, the way accounts got restructured, the way my father's attention got redirected. She had been watching for years, and she had decided to act. Walter had helped her create a separate trust, a discretionary trust, structured carefully and deliberately, entirely outside the estate that Gary and Diane had picked over. The trust held assets that my grandmother had transferred quietly over time, a second savings account that none of them knew about, a small portfolio of index funds, the deed to a piece of land she'd owned since the 1980s in a coastal county where property values had done things that would have surprised everyone, and this was the part that made me grip the edge of his desk: documentation. Specifically, documentation that Gary had, in the process of restructuring my grandmother's estate, violated 2 provisions of Georgia probate law. Walter had been collecting it for over a year. He had affidavits, he had bank records, he had correspondence. The trust, in total, held assets valued at just under $2 million. Every cent of it was designated for me with conditions that it be used for my professional development, my business ventures, or transferred outright after a simple verification process that Walter had already prepared. But that was only part of it. Walter slid a separate envelope across the desk. Inside was a letter, handwritten, 4 pages, in my grandmother's handwriting. He told me she had written it 6 months before she died. He told me she had made him promise to give it only to me, only in person, and only after I'd heard everything else first. I read it there in his office while he went to get us coffee. I'm not going to share everything she wrote. Some of it is too private, but there was one paragraph I've thought about almost every day since. She wrote, "I know you think I didn't see what was happening to you in that house. I saw everything. I was waiting for the right time, and I was building the right tools. I need you to know that everything you built in my kitchen belongs to you. The recipes, the concepts, the work. I had Walter document it. I had him notarize the dates. I had him create a record that no one can dispute. Your name is on all of it. It always was. I had to read that paragraph 3 times before I understood what she meant. She had anticipated the restaurant. She had known I was developing my menu in her kitchen, and she had, quietly and methodically, created a legal paper trail establishing that the intellectual foundation of my work had been created on her property, with her knowledge and under her explicit support. Documentation that would matter enormously if anyone ever tried to claim otherwise. I sat in Walter's office for a long time after I finished the letter. When Marcus and Priya found out what had happened, not everything, just the outline, they were furious on my behalf. Priya wanted to call a lawyer herself. Marcus, who was more measured, told me to focus on the opening and deal with the family situation afterward. He was right. We had 6 weeks until Linden opened. I needed to be present for that. The opening was a Thursday night in October. The dining room seated 62 people. We were fully reserved 3 weeks in advance. I had built a dessert menu around 7 dishes, each named for a place that had mattered to me. One of them named for a pale yellow house in Georgia. The reviews came in over the following 2 weeks. The food critic from the Charleston paper gave us 4 stars. A national food publication included us in a roundup of the most anticipated new restaurants in the South. A blogger with a significant following described my peanut butter semi-freddo as the best dessert she'd eaten in 3 years. My father texted me to say congratulations. I didn't respond. What I was doing instead, quietly and carefully, and with Rebecca and Walter both involved, was building a legal case. Rebecca filed a formal challenge to the probate process on the grounds that Gary had operated with a conflict of interest and had misrepresented the structure of my grandmother's estate to all parties, including my father. Walter submitted his documentation to the court. The affidavits, the bank records, the paper trail my grandmother had spent 2 years constructing. Gary, it turned out, had not been careful. He had assumed there was no one watching. He had assumed the only person who might have fought back was gone. He was wrong. The legal process took 7 months. I'm not going to walk you through every filing and counter-filing, because the honest truth is that even I stopped tracking it after a while and just let Rebecca handle it. What I can tell you is how it ended. It ended on a Tuesday afternoon in a courthouse in Savannah, in a room that held about 15 people, including my father, Diane, Brittany, Kayla, Gary, Rebecca, Walter, and me. The judge reviewed the documentation. She reviewed Gary's conflict of interest. He was Diane's first cousin, a fact that had not been disclosed to my grandmother or to any party outside Diane's immediate circle. She reviewed the bank records showing the timeline of account transfers. She reviewed Walter's affidavits. She ruled in my favor on every substantive point. The joint account Diane had been added to was found to have been structured in a manner inconsistent with my grandmother's expressed wishes. The assets were ordered to be redistributed. Gary was referred to the State Bar Association for a disciplinary review. My father's face, when the judge finished speaking, was a complicated thing to look at. I think he finally understood, in that room, everything he had chosen not to see for 30 years. He tried to speak to me afterward in the hallway. I let him say what he needed to say. I didn't respond with anger because I had stopped being angry somewhere around month 3 of the legal process. What I felt instead was something quieter than anger, and more permanent. I told him I needed time. I told him I would reach out when I was ready. I walked out of the courthouse and called Marcus from the parking lot, and told him I was going to be late for the afternoon prep meeting and he needed to start without me. He laughed and told me to take the whole day. Linden just completed its first full year of operation. We were nominated for a James Beard Award. Not a win. Not yet, but a nomination, which is its own kind of thing. We've expanded the dessert menu. I hired 2 pastry assistants. I sourced a new relationship with a small pecan farm in South Carolina that my grandmother would have loved. The $2 million from the trust is being used carefully. Some of it funded my equity stake in the restaurant's second location, which we announced last month. Some of it is in an account I don't touch, because I grew up with very little financial stability, and I know better than to spend what I don't have to spend. A portion of it went to Dorothy, my grandmother's oldest friend, as a contribution toward a community kitchen project she's been running in Savannah for 15 years. My grandmother would have wanted that. I have the cast iron skillets on a shelf in my restaurant kitchen, all 11 of them. My sous chef asked me once why they were there instead of in storage. I told her they were decorative. That's not the whole truth, but it's enough of it. The whole truth is that they are the only things I took from that living room on the day Diane smiled at me and handed me garbage bags. They have no meaningful monetary value. Gary said so himself. He was wrong about a lot of things. What I know now, what I think my grandmother understood long before I did, is that the people who try to erase you are counting on you to believe what they tell you. They are counting on you to accept the version of events they've constructed. They are counting on you to take your $11,000 and go quietly. My grandmother was quiet for a long time. But she was never still. There's a difference between those two things, and it took me 31 years to understand it. She was building something while they were taking things apart. She was writing letters while they were rewriting documents. She was sitting in Walter's office above a dry cleaner in Hardyville, telling a 74-year-old lawyer exactly what she needed him to do, and making him promise he would wait until the right person asked the right question. I was always going to ask. She knew that too. If you are somewhere in the middle of your own version of this, if you are in the part where things are being taken and no one is watching and you don't know what to do, I want you to hear this. Get a second opinion. Find the Walter in your life. Look for the people who were quiet while others were loud, because quiet people are often the ones who were paying the closest attention. And hold on to the things they tell you have no value. Sometimes those are exactly the things that matter most.